Manhattan, a 10th anniversary gala, and the woman sitting in Arden's chair was her husband's mistress. Sabine looked up, smiled, and said it just quiet enough to cut. Your seat, your key, and your husband are mine now. Merrick sat right beside her, not a word. Arden, 6 months pregnant, looked down at the blackened silver key seal on the table. The crescent scratch near the base, the one she made 8 years ago when she dropped it. And the corner of her mouth almost moved, because Sabine had just activated the one thing Arden spent 8 years building, waiting for exactly this moment. Don't go anywhere. The story starts right now. The cab pulled up to the entrance of Kincaid House Hotel at 7:43. 17 minutes late. Arden had planned to arrive before the guests, but her ankles had swollen again and it took twice as long to zip the side of her dress. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and stood there for a moment. The original Kincaid House, Manhattan's first, built in 9903 by Merrick's great-great-grandfather with 40 rooms and a lobby that smelled like cedar and old money. 120 years later, it was still the most photographed building in the company's portfolio. Tonight, gold light spilled from every window. Valets moved fast. A red carpet ran the full length of the entrance. This was the 10th anniversary of Merrick's chairmanship, which meant it was also, technically, Arden's. She pressed one hand to her stomach out of habit. 6 months along. The baby moved at 6 in the morning like clockwork, and again around 9 at night. Arden had started calling it the early bird. Merrick thought that was funny once. She couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed at anything she said. She walked through the entrance. The lobby was packed. Board members, investors, journalists, longtime hotel partners, all 500 of them dressed sharp and drinking champagne. Arden recognized a few faces. Some nodded. Some pretended not to see her. She kept moving toward the main ballroom. The double doors were already open. She heard the string quartet before she reached them. Then she stepped inside and stopped walking. At the center of the head table, the ceremonial seat that had always, for every Kincaid event in living memory, belonged to the spouse or co-steward of the family chairman, was Sabine Roth. She sat there like she had always been there. Back straight, hands folded on the table, dressed in deep burgundy. Her hair was up. Her jewelry was simple and expensive. She was talking to the man on her left and laughing at something he said. And Merrick was seated directly beside her. He saw Arden the moment she walked through the doors. He looked at her, then looked away, and picked up his water glass. Arden stood there long enough for several people nearby to notice. Then she walked toward the table. The closer she got, the more clearly she saw it. Resting on the white tablecloth in front of Sabine, not a decoration, not a replica. The founder's key seal, black and silver, an antique key at one end and a compass-shaped sealing stamp at the other. Small enough to hold in one hand, heavy enough that you always knew you were carrying it. For more than a century, that artifact had been held by one person at a time, the family chairman, or the legally recognized co-steward of the Kincaid Trust. It wasn't decorative. It was functional. It stamped binding succession documents. It opened the physical archive on the hotel's third floor. It authenticated digital records dating back to the late 1990s. The people who truly understood what it did were very few in number. Arden was one of them. She reached the table. A few guests shifted to watch. Sabine looked up first. Arden, she smiled. You look exhausted. Where did you get that? Arden said. She was looking at the artifact. Merrick gave it to me for the evening. Sabine touched the seal lightly with 2 fingers. He needed someone to hold this seat, and I was available. Arden looked at Merrick. He was studying the table. Merrick, she said, tell her to stand up. He set down the water glass. He folded his hands. For 1 second, she thought he was actually going to do it. She thought he was going to say something simple and corrective. She had known this man for 13 years. She had watched him make decisions in every kind of room, under every kind of pressure. She knew what it looked like when he was about to act. He didn't. We should talk later, he said. Not here. That was all. Sabine tilted her head and looked at Arden with something that wasn't quite sympathy. Your seat, your key, and your husband are mine now, she said it quietly. Quiet enough that only the nearest 3 or 4 people caught the words. But Arden heard every syllable. For a moment, the room became very still, at least for her. The string quartet kept playing. Conversations continued around them. A champagne glass clinked somewhere behind her back. Arden heard none of it clearly. She looked at the seal again. There was a crescent-shaped scratch near the base of the key. Small, easy to miss if you didn't know to look. She had made that scratch herself 8 years ago when she dropped it on the marble floor of her office. She'd been horrified at the time and called a jeweler. The jeweler told her the scratch was too shallow to smooth out without altering the metal around it. Better to leave it alone. The ceremonial replica that lived in the hotel's first-floor display case had no such scratch. Arden had checked once, years back, just to confirm what she already suspected. The replica was flawless, made to be looked at. This one, the one Sabine was touching, had the scratch. This was the real one. The one Merrick's grandfather had placed in Arden's private safe the year before he died. He had given it to her specifically because he trusted her with it. He had explained its deeper function quietly, without theater. He'd said, "Arden, what this does is more important than what it looks like." She had listened to every word. Merrick stood up from the table. He straightened his jacket and buttoned the single button. Then he walked past Arden toward the front of the room, toward the anniversary podium. He picked up the microphone and waited for the room to settle. 500 people turned toward him. 10 years ago, he said, I stood in this room with a different kind of ambition. What we built together since then belongs to every person in this company, not just to this family. He paused. The room responded with polite, attentive silence. Going forward, Kincaid House Hotels is entering a new era. He looked out across the crowd. He did not look at Arden, and I'm proud to say that the person who will stand beside me as we move into that era is someone who has shaped this company from the inside for the last 6 years. He gestured toward the head table. Sabine Roth. Applause spread through the room. Not wild, not standing. The measured applause of people who were confused but didn't want to be rude about it. A few board members exchanged glances. One senior partner leaned over and said something to the woman beside him. Arden didn't move. She was still looking at the founder's key seal. Sabine rose from the ceremonial seat and walked to the podium. She smiled at the audience, said a few gracious words about the company's history and the decade ahead. Thanked Merrick. She did not mention Arden by name, not once. Then she carried the seal to the podium herself. There was a slot built into the front panel, installed earlier this year as part of the formal ceremony, designed to receive the key. Arden had been told about that slot during the planning stages. She had been told because she was supposed to be the one using it. Sabine pressed the key in, turned it once. Then she lifted the stamp end and brought it down on a sealed declaration sitting on the podium surface. A single clean impression. Then she looked up at the ballroom screens, and now she said, a very special presentation. The screens flickered. The anniversary film title card that had been queued for weeks disappeared, replaced by something else entirely. Footage, interior footage, shot in a dim and restricted space with stone walls and wooden shelving. Arden recognized it immediately, the family archive on the 3rd floor, accessible only by the founder's key seal and 2 sets of private credentials. On screen, Sabine and Merrick were kissing, not staged, not old. Recent footage based on Sabine's hair, which was shorter in the video than it had been 6 months ago. The room went from polite applause to complete silence in about 3 seconds. Someone near the back said, "Oh, just that," one syllable. And in the corner of every screen, all of them simultaneously, a small symbol appeared. Compass rose. 8 points, clean and precise, centered inside a circle. Arden knew that symbol. She had designed it. She had chosen it specifically because a compass points north regardless of who is holding the device. She called the system North Star. She had built it during the early development years with Merrick's late grandfather, then quietly expanded it as the company's digital archive grew. Its purpose was authentication, verification. It recorded every person who used the founder's key seal. It verified every piece of media connected to a succession declaration. It did not announce itself unless something triggered it. Sabine had just triggered it. At the podium, Sabine was no longer composed. She stared at the screens and the color left her face. She pressed something on the podium panel. The footage kept playing. She pressed it again. Nothing changed. "That's not the video I uploaded," she said. Not to the audience. Not exactly to Merrick either. Just out loud, in the voice of someone who has walked straight into a wall they didn't know was there. "That is not what I put in." The footage continued. 18 seconds of it. The archive shelving visible behind them, the stone floor. No sound, just image. Then the screens went dark. Not switched, not cut to another frame. Simply dark, as though the system had shown exactly what it intended to show and had nothing further to add. Arden stood in the middle of the ballroom. 500 people were now looking at her, at Merrick, at Sabine, and at each other in various combinations. The string quartet had stopped. The servers near the walls had gone completely still. Merrick had gone pale, not with grief. She could read the expression across his face. She had seen it across enough board tables to know what it meant. He was already deciding what story to tell. Sabine turned away from the podium and looked at Arden directly. A moment passed where neither of them spoke. Then Sabine set the founder's key seal down on the podium surface, very carefully, like she was placing something she had already decided belonged to her and was simply choosing where to keep it for now. Arden kept her eyes on the compass symbol as it faded from the screens. She had designed North Star to do 2 things. First, verify. Second, remember every access, every use, every person who turned that key, and every piece of media they attached to a succession declaration. All of it stored in a system whose architecture only she fully understood. built into the very artifact Sabine had just used to try to rewrite the future of the Kincaid family. She thought of Merrick's grandfather. She thought of the day he pressed the real key into her hands. She thought of what he said. What this does is more important than what it looks like. Merrick crossed the ballroom toward her. He was already talking, his voice low, his mouth barely moving. We're going to address this calmly, privately. This doesn't go further. She didn't answer Arden. I need you to stay composed. She looked at him. Her husband, 13 years. The father of the child pressing slow and steady against her ribs right now. 6 months old and unnamed and entirely unaware that the room he or she was about to be born into had just changed completely. You didn't correct her, Arden said. When she sat down in my seat, you didn't say a word. He started to answer. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom entrance. Not fast. There was no point in theater. The night had already provided enough of that on its own. Behind her, Sabine was speaking to someone near the podium. Guests were beginning to talk again in low, fractured voices. Someone on the event staff asked quietly whether they should resume the program. The founder's key seal sat on the podium surface. The compass mark had faded from the screens, but the system behind it was still running, still recording, still remembering everything, the way it had been built to do, the way Sabine had never thought to ask about before she pressed the key into the slot and stamped her name onto a document she didn't fully understand. She thought she was using it. It was using her. The car Merrick sent was already waiting outside when Arden came through the hotel entrance. Black sedan, tinted windows, engine running. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't asked for anything. He had sent it anyway, which told her a great deal about what the next few hours were going to look like. She got in. The driver didn't speak. She didn't either. She watched the hotel shrink in the side mirror as they pulled away, gold lights still blazing from every floor, valet still moving, guests still inside. 500 people who had witnessed something they would be talking about for years. She thought about that, about what the story would sound like by morning. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. The baby had been still for an hour. That sometimes happened when Arden's heart rate climbed. She had read enough to know it wasn't dangerous. She also knew that knowing something isn't dangerous and feeling calm about it are entirely different things. They drove downtown. The car stopped in front of a building she recognized, one of the smaller Kincaid properties used for private meetings, not a hotel. An office suite on the 11th floor that Merrick used when he didn't want anything on the main campus calendar. She took the elevator up alone. Merrick was already there, so was Sabine. So was a man Arden didn't recognize, sitting at the far end of the conference table with a laptop and a leather binder. Merrick introduced him as a communications associate. He didn't give a last name. Sit down, Merrick said. I'll stand. He looked at the communications associate, then back at her. Arden, tell me what Sabine was doing with the founder's key seal. Sabine, seated at the table, didn't look up from her phone. She had repaired her composure by the time they got there. The pale, cornered expression from the ballroom was gone. She was back to the version of herself she showed in meetings. That conversation can wait, Merrick said. What cannot wait is the fact that 500 people just watched unauthorized footage appear on those screens, and the press is already outside the hotel. I didn't put it there. Your system did. She looked at him. My system responded to an attempt to misuse the founder's key seal. That's what it was designed to do. You built a system inside our family infrastructure without disclosing its full function to the board, and tonight it broadcast private footage to a room full of journalists and business partners. He stopped, pulled a folder from the table and held it out toward her. I need you to sign this. She didn't take the folder. It's a statement, he said. It confirms that the technical malfunction during the gala presentation was caused by an error in a system under your administrative control. It doesn't assign blame. It simply accepts operational responsibility, which is another way of saying it assigns blame. It protects you. If you sign this, we frame tonight as a technical failure, a glitch, no story, no press cycle, no one digging into your pregnancy or your medical history or anything else. There it was, the shape of it. He'd managed to wrap a threat inside an offer in about 40 words. If you cooperate, we keep the press away from your baby. If you don't, whatever happens next is your problem. She set the folder back on the table. I'm not signing anything tonight. Sabine finally looked up. You should know, she said, that the presentation I uploaded for this evening contains something important, something the board needed to see. She folded her hands on the table. I had obtained footage of you with Callum Pierce, evidence of a private relationship that goes well beyond a professional arrangement. The name hit like a door slammed open in a quiet room. Callum Pierce was the family trust attorney. He had served the Kincaid estate for 9 years. Arden had worked closely with him on succession documents, trust amendments, and the incorporation filings related to North Star. He was also the one person outside of Merrick's late grandfather who had any partial knowledge of how the authentication system worked. That's a lie, Arden said. I have access records, Sabine said. She nodded toward the communications associate, who opened his laptop and turned it so Arden could see the screen. These are from the ballroom broadcast system. Administrative credentials were used during the transmission window. Your credentials. Arden looked at the screen. She looked at the timestamps. She didn't respond immediately. Her administrative credentials, tied to her name, tied to her North Star access profile, showing activity during the exact window when the gala presentation had been activated. Those records show that a transmission was attempted using my credentials, Arden said. They don't show that I was the one transmitting. The system logged you, Sabine said. The system logged an attempt made using my credentials. There's a difference. North Star records the attempt and the source. It doesn't verify the person. That's not its function. Sabine smiled, just slightly, which is a distinction that sounds very convenient right now. Merrick cut in. Arden, the board is going to be asking questions by morning. The story is already in circulation. I need something I can give them. Give them the truth. The truth is that your system showed footage of me and Sabine at a private function, in a restricted space, to an audience that included 2 television journalists. The truth is embarrassing for everyone, including you. Yes, including me. He didn't flinch on that. She gave him credit for it. Which is why I'm trying to contain it before it becomes something that follows our child for the next 20 years. She had expected him to say something like that eventually. She had not expected it to land as hard as it did, because it wasn't wrong. Not entirely. There was a version of this where she fought hard and publicly, and the papers ran her pregnancy alongside the gala footage, and the story became something ugly and lasting. She had watched that happen to other families. She had watched the children of those families grow up carrying weight that was never theirs to carry. That was his real leverage, not the statement, not the communications associated with the laptop, the child. Specifically, her need to protect a baby who hadn't been born yet and could not protect herself. She told herself she understood that clearly. She told herself she would remember it, and then she made the decision she would later describe to Callum as the most expensive mistake of her professional life. I'll take a temporary leave from the board, she said. 30 days, on the condition that no statement is released without my legal review, and no one contacts Callum Pierce without going through his attorney. Merrick exhaled. The tension in his shoulders dropped by about half an inch. That's reasonable, he said. Sabine said nothing, but Arden saw it, just for a moment. A small, controlled stillness in her expression that wasn't relief. It was calculation. She was already thinking about what came next. I want it in writing, Arden said. 30 days, reviewed monthly, and I retain access to North Star's read-only logs during the leave period. That's fine, Merrick said. Sabine nodded once. Agreeable. Cooperative. Everything you could ask for. Arden left the building at 11:42. She sat in the back of a cab and watched the city move past the window and didn't let herself feel anything until she was home and had locked the door behind her. Then she called Callum. He picked up on the second ring, I heard, he said. I saw the coverage. Are you all right? I need you to look at the North Star logs, specifically the transmission records from tonight. Anything connected to the ballroom broadcast window. A pause. They're going to try to lock you out of the system. I know. That's why I kept the read-only access in the agreement. But the logs I want are in a separate partition, backup partition. Sabine doesn't know it exists. She heard him writing something down. When do you need this? Yesterday. I'll start now, he said. Arden, what were they planning to show? Before North Star interrupted it. She told him. All of it. The alleged affair, the fabricated footage, her name on the access records. Callum was quiet for a long moment. They were going to say it was you and me, he said. Yes. Because if the board believed that, you'd be in violation of
the morality clause in the trust charter,
she said, which removes my voting authority and my unborn child's provisional place in the succession structure. He didn't say anything for several seconds. I'll find the backup logs, he said. Get some sleep if you can. She didn't sleep. Over the next 3 days, Merrick and Sabine moved fast. They presented the board with a summary of the gala incident that emphasized Arden's emotional instability. The phrasing was careful. The documents never said she was unfit. They said she was under enormous personal and physical strain. They said a temporary absence from board responsibilities was a compassionate and prudent step that she herself had agreed to. They quoted her acceptance of the 30-day leave. They made it sound like something she had requested for her own benefit. 4 board members pushed back. 3 of them were people Merrick's grandfather had appointed. One of them called Arden directly. Is this voluntary, he asked. His name was Gerald Farr, 68 years old, former corporate attorney, the person who had co-signed the original North Star development agreement when Arden first proposed it 8 years ago. In the sense that I chose it over the alternative they were offering, Arden said. Yes, he understood what that meant. He told her to document everything. She already was. On the morning of the 4th day, Callum called her back. I found the audio file, he said. She sat down at her kitchen table. Tell me, it's fragmented. North Star rejected it during the transmission attempt, which is why the fabricated video never played. But the rejection generated a recovery record. I pulled the full record from the backup partition. And the authorization oath attached to the video, the voice authentication required to certify a succession declaration. It's not a recording of you giving consent. It's assembled, word by word, pulled from different conversations you had over the past 18 months. She pressed her fingers flat against the table. Someone recorded you, Callum said, multiple times. Private conversations by the sound of it. Not conference calls, not public remarks. Close-range audio. How many recordings? At least 7 distinct source files. I can hear the differences in the background noise. Different rooms, different times of day. He paused. There are 13 seconds missing from the assembly, right in the middle of the oath. Either they couldn't find the right words to fill the gap, or they removed something that would have exposed the splice too clearly. 13 seconds. Gone. She thought about the past year and a half. How many rooms she had spoken freely in, believing she was alone or among people she trusted. Merrick's office, the medical suite where she had her prenatal appointments, board preparation meetings, casual conversations in the family section of the hotel. Is there a final piece, she asked, after the assembled oath? Is there anything else on the record? Callum was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. The backup partition caught one more audio fragment before the transmission was killed. It's not part of the authorization sequence. It's ambient sound from whatever room Sabine was in when she built the file. Play it, she heard clicking. A brief pause. Then audio, slightly compressed but clear enough. Sabine's voice. Once the wife is removed, the child loses the protection with her. The line was delivered plainly. No drama in it. Not a threat being issued. An outcome being stated. A fact on a to-do list. Once the wife is removed, the child loses the protection with her. Same tone you'd use to say once the contract expires, the rate reverts to standard. That was the part that stayed with Arden, not the malice, the casualness of it. She had spent 6 months growing a person inside her body. 6 months of early mornings and swollen ankles and a husband who had stopped laughing at her jokes. 6 months of telling herself that families go through difficult periods and come back from them, that the alternative was her child growing up the way she had grown up. In the wreckage of 2 parents who had turned every public space into a courtroom. And in one offhand sentence, Sabine had reduced all of that to a liability to be cleared. Callum, Arden said, I need you to preserve every copy of that file. Already done. 3 separate locations, physical and encrypted cloud backup. And I need you to check the access logs on the family archive, specifically the founder's key seal usage records. Sabine has operational access now. She's going to try to clean those logs. I'll check today. She won't wait, Arden said. She started the moment I walked out of that building. She was right. When Callum pulled the log review 2 hours later, he found that 7 entries related to the founder's key seal had already been deleted from the primary system. He reported this to Arden without editorializing. He was a careful man and he chose his words precisely. He said, 7 entries are absent from the primary log that were present in the transmission record generated during the gala. She asked him how many total unauthorized entries the backup partition showed. He said 17. 17 times. 17 times someone had used the founder's key seal without the system's full authorization. 17 separate moments when the artifact had been turned and pressed and used to touch something it had no right to touch. She thought about the scratch on the key, the crescent mark near the base, made 8 years ago when she dropped it on a marble floor, made when she was the only person who knew she had it, in an office she worked in alone, building a system that was designed exactly for this kind of moment. Merrick's grandfather had told her something the afternoon he placed the key in her hands. He had been sitting across from her in the archive room, surrounded by shelving that held records going back over a century, and he had said it the way old people sometimes say things that are actually quite simple, but sound larger in that context. He had said, the key doesn't give power, Arden. It records it. Anyone who thinks carrying this means they own something has already made their first mistake. She had thought about that a lot in the early years. Less so after Merrick took over the chairmanship and the company grew and everything got louder. She had thought about it again tonight, listening to Callum read timestamps off a backup log, counting 17 entries that someone had believed would never be found. She pulled a yellow legal pad from the kitchen drawer. She uncapped a pen. She wrote Callum's name at the top and underlined it. Then she wrote the number 17 and circled it. Then she wrote 13 seconds and put a box around it. Then she wrote the sentence, not because she'd forget it, because writing it made it real in a different way than hearing it had. Once the wife is removed, the child loses the protection with her. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to a clean page and started writing what she would need to prove it. Merrick called on a Thursday morning. 10 days into the 30-day leave. Arden was at the kitchen table with coffee she had barely touched and a printed copy of the backup partition log spread in front of her. She let the phone ring 3 times before she answered. "I need to see you," he said. "Then come here." A pause. "You want me to come to the brownstone? I'm not meeting you in a Kincaid building right now, Merrick." He came that afternoon. She heard the car pull up. She heard him on the front steps. She opened the door before he knocked and walked back to the kitchen without saying anything. He followed her in and stood near the counter with his coat still on, looking like a man who hadn't decided yet what posture to take. She sat down across from her papers and waited. He looked at the printed logs. He looked at the yellow legal pad with her handwriting on it. He didn't ask to see any of it. "I owe you a full explanation," he said. "Start with the affair." He took his coat off slowly and draped it over the back of a chair. Then he sat down. His hands went flat on the table. She had watched him assume that posture in 100 meetings. Hands flat, shoulders square, voice measured. It meant he was about to say something difficult and had already decided how to frame it. "It began 11 months ago," he said. "Not earlier, I know you're going to ask." 11 months. She ran the timeline in her head automatically. 11 months ago, she had been 8 weeks pregnant. She had told him on a Sunday evening after dinner quietly, with a test she'd taken twice to be sure. He had held her and said he was happy. He had gone to the first prenatal appointment with her. He had been there in the room when they first heard the heartbeat on the monitor. And 3 weeks after that, he had started sleeping with Sabine. She didn't say any of that out loud. She just looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know what you're thinking. Then keep going." He did. He told her when it started, where. He told her it had developed alongside what he described as a working relationship that became something else, which was the kind of language men use when they want to describe a choice as though it were a weather event. She let him finish. "The founder's key seal," she said. "Tell me how she got it." He was quiet for a moment. "I gave it to her, from my safe." Yes, she absorbed that. He had gone into her private safe, taken the original artifact that Merrick's own grandfather had placed there specifically, and handed it to his mistress. Not for the succession, not for the archive. Because Sabine said she needed it for the anniversary presentation and he had believed her. "She told me it was ceremonial," Merrick said. "She said she wanted to use it for the gala, for the visual, for the seal on the anniversary declaration. I thought she understood what it was. She understood exactly what it was. That's the problem." He didn't argue that.
"And the documents?" she asked. "Callum's team found a sealed board resolution in the archive queue."
"A resolution transferring temporary control of the trust to you, with the right to name a representative." Merrick's expression shifted, not dramatically, but she caught it. "She drafted it," he said. "She told me it was a contingency document, in case the gala announcement required a formal board follow-through. She said the representative would be a transition structure, temporary, administrative." "Did you read it before you signed?" He didn't answer immediately. Merrick. Her voice was flat. "Did you read it?" "Not in full." There it was. All the architecture of a disaster built in layers. He hadn't read the documents. He hadn't questioned the transfer of the key. He hadn't asked why a gala presentation required a sealed succession resolution. He had signed his name and assumed good faith from a woman he was sleeping with, while his pregnant wife believed she was saving her marriage by staying quiet. "That resolution," Arden said, "was not designed to give you temporary control. It was written to transfer authority to whoever holds the founder's key seal after the board vote. Which means it was designed to transfer authority to Sabine." Merrick looked up. "The morality clause in the trust charter removes my voting rights if the board accepts evidence of personal conduct that violates the ethical standards of the co-steward role," Arden said. "The fabricated video was meant to trigger that clause. Once I was removed, my provisional succession protection for the baby would fall with me. The resolution would pass, and the person Sabine intended to name as your representative was herself." He stood up from the table. "That's not what she told me." "I know that's not what she told you." "I never agreed to remove my own child from the family trust," he said. "You have to know that. Whatever I allowed to happen with Sabine, I would never have agreed to that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Merrick, you handed her the key. You signed documents you didn't read. You stood in front of 500 people and announced that she would be standing beside you going forward, while your pregnant wife stood in the doorway without a seat." He opened his mouth. "You didn't agree to remove your child," she said. "You just handed someone else every tool she needed to do it. And then you told yourself you hadn't done anything wrong because you never said the words." He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she watched him process it. She had known this man long enough to recognize what it looked like when something he had told himself, some story about his own intentions, was no longer holding together under the weight of the actual facts. He turned around eventually. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to request an emergency board hearing," Arden said. "I'm going to present a full forensic examination of North Star, Every log, every reconstruction, every piece of audio Callum recovered. I'm going to do it in front of the entire board. Merrick stared at her. You can't do that. I can and I will. Arden. He crossed back to the table. His voice was different now, urgent in a way that wasn't entirely about her. If you expose North Star's internal architecture publicly, you void the confidentiality protections in the Harlow licensing agreement. That deal is worth $340 million. It's the largest technology contract this company has ever signed. If it collapses, I know what it's worth. Then you know that hundreds of employees' jobs are attached to that agreement. The expansion in Phoenix, the renovation projects, the new partnerships in Seattle and Dallas. All of it is funded through that licensing deal. If you disclose the system architecture in a board hearing, Harlow's legal team will tear the contract apart inside of 48 hours. She had thought about this. She had lain awake thinking about it. She had made lists of the people whose livelihoods were connected to that agreement, and she had felt genuinely sick doing it. She understood what she would be putting at risk. She had not arrived at this decision easily. You have used the company's reputation as an excuse for cowardice long enough, she said. He looked at her as though she had struck him. Every time you had a choice, she said, you reached for the company. When Sabine started making decisions you should have questioned, you reached for the company. When she took the seat that belonged to me, you reached for the company. When she handed you documents and asked you to sign without reading them, you didn't ask questions because asking questions would have created a scandal that might embarrass the company. And right now, you are standing in my kitchen telling me not to expose the truth because of the company. I'm telling you because of the people who work there. Then you should have thought about those people before you handed my private safe key to a woman who was planning to steal the succession from an unborn child. He stood very still. I am going to that board hearing, she said. I am going to show them exactly what North Star found. And I need you to decide right now whether you're going to tell me the truth about everything, or whether you're going to walk out of here and keep trying to manage this the way you manage everything. He sat back down, slowly. He sat like a man who was suddenly very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Ask me what you need to ask. So she did. Methodically, the way she approached everything, not in anger, which surprised her. She was past the part where rage would be useful. She needed facts. She asked about every document he had signed. Every conversation with Sabine about the gala, every access to the archive, every occasion when he had been present and said nothing when saying something would have stopped what was coming. He answered. Not completely. There were gaps. There were moments when his memory was conveniently vague. But he answered more honestly than she had expected, and she wrote down what mattered. At 4:30 in the afternoon, she asked him one last question. The North Star backup logs show 17 unauthorized entries on the founder's key seal. I've been working through the identification codes attached to each one. He waited. 16 of them are registered to Sabine's credentials or to devices she controlled. Arden looked at the printed log on the table. The 17th entry is registered to a private identification code, one that isn't attached to Sabine's profile. She turned the paper around so he could see it. He looked at the code printed on the page. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. That's your code, Merrick, she said. Your personal identification. The one that was registered to your account 8 years ago when I first set up the system. He said nothing. The timestamp on that entry is from the night of the gala, she said. The same night you told me you knew nothing about what Sabine was planning. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside a car passed on the street. The baby moved just briefly, a small interior shift that Arden registered and set aside. She waited. I accessed the archive, he said finally, earlier that evening, before the gala started. To do what? He closed his eyes, just for a second. She needed the resolution inside the archive system before the ceremony, for the stamp to register properly when she used the key. She said it was a procedural step. He stopped. She asked me to log the access so it would appear authorized. Arden pulled the paper back toward herself, so it hadn't been a clean deception with Merrick as the man who was tricked. He had known on some level. Not everything. Maybe not the morality clause. Maybe not the plan to name herself as his representative. Maybe not the full scope of what Sabine intended to do to the child's succession rights. But he had walked into that archive on the night of the gala and logged an access entry using his personal code to help Sabine position a document she needed in place before the ceremony. He had known enough to act, and he had acted in Sabine's direction. You said you didn't know what she was planning, Arden said. I didn't know all of it, but you knew enough to help her. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He sat at her kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his coat draped over the chair beside him, and he looked at the yellow legal pad with her handwriting on it, and he didn't answer the question. That was in its own way an answer. She stood up and gathered the papers from the table, the printed logs, the legal pad, the timeline she had drafted 3 nights ago at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. She stacked them and set them on the counter. "The board hearing will be scheduled through Callum's office," she said. "You'll receive formal notice. Arden, I'm asking you to leave now." He didn't argue. He picked up his coat and walked to the front of the house. She heard him pause at the door. "I didn't want this," he said. Not loudly. "Whatever you think of me right now, I need you to know I didn't want it to go this far." She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. "I know," she said. "You never want anything to go this far. You just never do anything to stop it." He opened the door and went out. She stood there for a moment after it closed. Then she walked back to the counter and picked up her phone and called Callum. He answered on the first ring. "Request the emergency board hearing," she said. "Full forensic presentation. I want every board member present. Physical attendance, no proxy votes." A brief pause. "And the Harlow agreement?" She had made this decision. She had sat with it for days and she had made it. "We'll deal with that after," she said. "Schedule the hearing." "Done," Callum said. "Arden, there's something you should know. I ran the full count on the key seal usage log again this afternoon. And, including the entry attached to Merrick's code, Callum said the total is 17. But there's one more entry in the queue, an 18th. It hasn't activated yet." She went still. "What do you mean it hasn't activated?" "It's staged," he said. "Preloaded. Whatever it's attached to, it's set to execute at the board hearing. Whoever staged it was planning for the hearing to happen. They set something up inside the archive to trigger when the key seal is used in a formal board session." She thought about Sabine, about what Sabine would do when she realized the hearing had been called. About 17 entries already used and one more prepared and waiting. "Don't touch it," Arden said. "Don't alter it. Don't flag it in the primary system. Don't let anyone know we found it. You want to let it run. I want to let whoever staged it believe they're still in control," she said. "Right up until the moment they're not." She hung up and stood in her kitchen in the late afternoon light. 6 months pregnant, facing a board hearing that might cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars and cost her the last remnants of the life she had tried to hold together. She picked up the yellow legal pad and flipped to a clean page. At the top she wrote what the 18th entry is meant to do. Then she started thinking. The emergency board hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday at 9 in the morning. Kincaid House Hotel's primary boardroom, 15th floor, the one with the long mahogany table and the windows that faced east. Arden had sat in that room dozens of times. She knew the acoustics. She knew the way the morning light came in at an angle that made the far end of the table harder to read. She had chosen the seat she wanted 3 days in advance. Callum filed the formal notice Monday afternoon. By Monday evening, 3 board members had called Arden directly. By Monday night, someone had leaked the hearing to a financial press contact, and a reporter from a business wire outlet had emailed the company's communications department asking for comment. Sabine would have seen that, would have spent Monday night deciding how to walk into Tuesday's room. Arden got to the building at 8:15. She went up alone, set her materials at her seat, and stood at the window for a few minutes looking at the street below. Then she sat down and waited. The board members arrived in pairs, mostly. Gerald Farr came in first, alone, and gave Arden a brief nod before taking his seat. He brought a legal pad and a pen and no laptop, which was Gerald's way of signaling that he intended to pay close attention. The other members filtered in over the next 20 minutes. 12 total. 2 joined remotely on a screen at the far end of the room, faces slightly compressed by the camera angle. Merrick came in at 8:54. He sat at his usual place near the center of the table. He looked at Arden once. She looked back at him without expression, then returned her attention to her notes. Sabine arrived at 8:58. She carried the founder's key seal in one hand, not in a case, not wrapped. Just held it openly, the way someone carries something they have decided belongs to them. She was dressed in charcoal gray. Her hair was down. She set the key seal on the table in front of her seat and placed a thin folder beside it. The room watched her do this. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had been in the role for 4 years and ran hearings with the efficiency of someone who billed by the minute, called the session to order at 9 sharp. "We're here on an emergency basis," Patricia said. "The matter before this board concerns the events of the 10th anniversary gala, the integrity of the North Star authentication system, and questions about the founder's key seal and its recent use. We'll hear opening positions and then examine the available evidence."
"Ms. Roth, you filed the initial formal complaint. You have the floor."
Sabine stood. She was composed, genuinely not performatively. Whatever she had felt in the ballroom that night, the unguarded panic of watching the wrong footage appear on those screens was not present in this room. She had had 2 weeks to rebuild. She had used them well. "Thank you, Patricia."
She looked around the table without rushing. "I want to be direct with this board. What I'm about to present is uncomfortable. But the integrity of the Kincaid Trust and the reliability of the systems that govern it are worth the discomfort."
She opened her folder. North Star was designed and built by Arden Kincaid over a period of 8 years. During that time, the full architecture of the system was disclosed to no one on this board, to no external auditor, and to no regulatory body. We accepted her assurances that it was a protective authentication layer. Sabine paused. What the gala revealed is that North Star is capable of selecting, generating, and broadcasting content independently with no confirmation step and no external override. That is not a protective system. It is a system that allows one person to control what this board sees and when they see it. She sat down. No one spoke for a moment. Then Sabine added, "It is my position that North Star was designed to manufacture evidence whenever its creator feels threatened." The room shifted, not dramatically, but Arden felt it, the weight of the sentence landing on 12 people who had already been unsettled for 2 weeks and were now being offered a frame for their discomfort. Patricia turned to Arden. "Miss Kincaid, your response." Arden stood. She had written 3 versions of her opening remarks. She had practiced them. She had edited them down twice. In the end, she had decided to set the notes aside. "Sabine is right that the full architecture of North Star was not disclosed to this board," she said. "She is right that I designed it and that I alone understood its complete function. Those are accurate statements." She looked around the table. "She is wrong about what the system does. And I'm going to prove that today by doing something that will cost this company money and will likely cost me my professional reputation in the short term." Gerald Farr was already watching her with the focused attention of someone who had practiced law for 40 years and could tell when someone was about to say something that mattered. "North Star does not manufacture evidence," Arden said. "It authenticates and reconstructs. There is a critical difference. A system that manufactures selects what to show based on a desired outcome. A system that reconstructs shows the original source material regardless of what that outcome might be." She paused. "I'm going to demonstrate that distinction right now, and I'm going to ask Sabine to help me do it." Sabine looked up. "The founder's key seal is in front of you," Arden said. "The archive console is connected to the boardroom system." She gestured toward the panel built into the far wall. "I'm asking you to repeat the exact process you used on the night of the gala. Insert the key. Stamp the resolution you brought. Play the recorded oath." The room went very quiet. Sabine looked at the key seal on the table. "That's a reasonable request," Patricia said evenly. "Ms. Roth, if the system behaves differently depending on who controls it, that is material to this hearing." Sabine closed her folder. She stood, picked up the key seal, and walked to the archive console at the wall panel. She moved without hesitation, which told Arden that she had a plan for this. She had anticipated the challenge. She believed she had prepared for it. She inserted the key into the console slot. The system recognized it. A low tone, a confirmation light. She stamped the disputed resolution against the panel's surface. Clean impression. Then she reached into her folder and produced a small device, a voice recording. She connected it to the console's input port and pressed play. The recorded oath began. Arden's voice, or something assembled to sound like it, speaking the formal authorization language required for a succession declaration. And then North Star spoke, not a voice. Text, appearing on every screen in the boardroom simultaneously, white letters against dark background. Authorization review initiated. Source analysis in progress. 8 separate audio cuts identified. The system listed them sequentially on screen. Source file 1, source file 2, through to 8. Each one time-stamped, each one labeled with a location identifier. Office, medical suite B, conference room 3, lobby corridor, private car, home residential address, home residential address. Someone had recorded Arden in her home. Sabine stood at the console and her composure held for about 4 seconds past that line appearing on screen. Then it cracked, not completely. But Arden saw her jaw tighten and her hand move to the console edge. Authorization identified as fraudulent. Source reconstruction initiated. The screen shifted. First image, Sabine, inside Arden's prenatal appointment, recorded from a phone camera angled downward to look incidental. Arden, visible in the background, seated on the examination table in a hospital gown. The date stamp in the corner matched a checkup from 7 months ago. Someone on the board said audibly, "My God." Second image, Sabine in a board preparation meeting, phone face down on the table, positioned toward where Arden was seated. The angle was tight, deliberately obscured. Third image, a residential interior. Arden's kitchen. Arden speaking to someone on her phone, unaware of any recording device. The camera was positioned low, possibly from a bag or a coat pocket. The room had gone completely still. Fourth image, the family archive. Merrick and Sabine, standing over the archive console. The timestamp placed this 9 days before the gala. Audio restored now, clear enough to understand, Sabine's voice from the footage. Once she's disqualified under the morality clause, the succession protection for the child falls with her position. The resolution passes, you retain nominal control, and the naming authority transfers. Merrick's voice, who gets named? Sabine's voice, I do. As your designated representative. Merrick's voice quieter, that wasn't what we discussed. Sabine's voice, it's the cleanest structure. You remain chairman in title. I hold the operational authority. It protects us both. The audio stopped. A second later, a new clip began. This one without Merrick present. Sabine alone in the archive, speaking to her phone. Her voice, the resolution isn't written for Merrick. It's written for whoever physically holds the founder's key seal when the board vote completes. He thinks he's retaining authority. He's not. Once the vote passes, the key is all that matters. And I'll have the key. Silence. Total, complete silence in the boardroom. Arden looked at Merrick. He was staring at the screen where Sabine's image had just spoken plainly about the plan to discard him once he had served his purpose. His face was doing something complicated. Betrayal mixed with something that looked, underneath it, like the specific humiliation of a man who had chosen to believe what he wanted to believe and was now watching that choice play out in front of 12 colleagues.
Patricia Voss said carefully, Ms. Roth. Would you like to address what this board just heard?
Sabine had turned away from the console. She walked back to her seat and sat down and placed both hands on the table. Her composure was rebuilt, just slightly imperfect at the edges, but rebuilt. The system is selecting what to show, she said. That is exactly my point. We have no way to verify that this reconstruction is accurate and not curated. I anticipated that argument, Arden said. She stood and walked to the console. She addressed the board directly, still standing. In order to demonstrate that I have no ability to influence which files Northstar reconstructs, I am going to disclose the core authentication architecture of the system, publicly, in this room, right now. She paused. I want this board to understand what that means. The Harlow licensing agreement contains a confidentiality provision that protects the system's design. Disclosing the architecture in a formal proceeding will trigger that provision. The contract will almost certainly be voided. The company will lose $340 million in licensing revenue. Expansion projects will be suspended. Jobs will be affected. She looked at Patricia. I'm making that disclosure anyway, because the only way to prove I cannot control what this system shows is to show you how it works. Gerald Farr leaned forward in his chair. Arden spent the next 22 minutes walking the board through Northstar's authentication design, not the full code, not the proprietary encryption layers, but the structural logic, how the backup partition recorded every access attempt independently of the primary system, how the reconstruction protocol pulled from source files stored in a read-only archive that no single user credential could modify, how the output sequence was determined not by any user command but by the chronological order of the original files as they had been stored. She answered 7 questions. She drew 2 diagrams on the whiteboard at the side wall. When she finished, she went back to her seat and produced a document from her folder. Old paper, not a printout, an actual physical document in a protective sleeve. This is the original Kincaid family charter, she said. The document that established the founder's key seal as a functional artifact rather than a ceremonial one. It was drafted by Harlan Kincaid in 9961 and has not been altered since. She passed it to Gerald Farr, who examined it and passed it to the board member on his left. Page 7, Arden said. 3rd paragraph. The room waited while the document made its way around the table. Patricia read it first. Then she looked up. Read aloud, please, someone said from the far end of the table. Patricia read, the founder's key seal does not confer authority upon the person who holds it. Its purpose is singular and permanent, to create an irreversible record of any person who attempts to exercise the Finn family's founding authority unlawfully so that no future generation may be deceived about what was done and who chose to do it. The room sat with that for a moment. That language, Arden said, is the reason Northstar behaves the way it does. The system was built around the charter's original intent. I didn't invent the principle. I built software that honored it. She brought up the usage log on the boardroom screen. Northstar's backup partition recorded 17 unauthorized uses of the founder's key seal. Every one of them is time-stamped, location-stamped, and tied to a specific credential. She walked through them, not all 17 in detail, the key ones, the archive accesses, the attempts to pre-stage documents, the recording sessions that harvested Arden's voice from private conversations, the entry from the night of the gala, when Sabine had used the key to stamp the false resolution. The board watched the log scroll. 16 entries tied to Sabine's credentials or her controlled devices. Then the 17th. This entry, Arden said, is registered under a personal identification code. It is not Sabine's credential. She left the log on screen. She walked back to her seat and stood behind it, both hands on the back of the chair, and looked down the table at her husband. Merrick was looking at the screen. He had been looking at it since the 17th entry appeared. His face was the face of a man who had arrived at a place he could not reason his way out of and knew it. The timestamp on that entry is from the night of the gala, Arden said. It precedes the ceremony by approximately 90 minutes. It matches the window when the false resolution had to be pre-staged inside the archive for the key stamp to register as authorized during the ceremony. She let the room absorb that. Then she said, "The credential attached to this entry belongs to Merrick Kincaid." Patricia Voss said nothing. Gerald Farr said nothing. The board member who had been most vocal in defending Arden during the leave period sat back in her chair and pressed her fingers to her mouth. Merrick was still looking at the screen. Arden waited. She gave it the full silence it deserved. Then she said it quietly, without theater, without a raised voice, looking directly at the man she had married 13 years ago and believed she knew. "Did she deceive you, Merrick? Or did you simply expect me to disappear quietly?" He turned his head and looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. And in the silence that followed, with 12 board members and 2 faces on a remote screen and a boardroom full of morning light, the answer that wouldn't come was the most complete answer he had ever given her. Patricia Voss set the family charter document carefully on the table in front of her. "This board will take a brief recess," she said. "When we return, I will expect formal statements from both Mr. Kincaid and Ms. Roth. We will also need to discuss interim governance structure pending a full investigation." She looked at Arden. "Ms. Kincaid, I want you to know that this board recognizes the significant cost of what you disclosed today." Arden nodded once. "I hope so," she said, "because I'd like it to be worth something." She sat down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at the window and the east-facing light coming in at its morning angle, the same angle it always came in at, the same room she had sat in dozens of times before. The founder's key seal was still sitting at Sabine's empty place at the table. Sabine had walked out during the recess without being asked to leave, which told Arden everything she needed to know about what Sabine was going to do next. She picked up her phone and sent Callum one word, "Ready." Then she put the phone face down and waited for Patricia to call the room back to order. The family archive was on the 3rd floor of the original hotel building, behind a door that required 2 credentials and a physical key. Arden had been inside it hundreds of times. Stone walls, wooden shelving. The temperature kept cool and steady. It smelled like old paper and metal and something she had never been able to name. She found Sabine there 40 minutes after the board recess began. Sabine was at the central table with the forged succession resolution spread flat in front of her. She had a lighter in one hand. She hadn't used it yet. She was reading the document, which meant she was looking for something specific in it, some page or clause she could remove before she burned the rest. She looked up when Arden came through the door. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Sabine set the lighter on the table. "You should know," she said, "that Merrick gave me everything I needed, willingly. Your voice recordings, your access codes, your medical appointment schedule, your signature samples." She kept her hands flat on the document. "Whatever story he's preparing to tell this board, that's the truth underneath it." "I believe you," Arden said. That wasn't the answer Sabine expected. Her expression shifted slightly. "Then you understand he isn't innocent in this." "I've known that since he came to my kitchen," Arden said. She walked further into the room and stopped on the other side of the table. "I'm not here about Merrick." Sabine waited. "I want you to explain something to me," Arden said. "You built a career out of protecting this company's image. You restructured the public relations division. You managed 3 major crises in 6 years. You kept this family's name clean through things that should have destroyed it. I watched you do that work. I never underestimated it." Sabine said nothing. "So explain to me why a child had to be removed from the trust," Arden said. "She hasn't been born yet. She has done nothing to you. She has no power, no vote, no access. She is 6 months old inside my body. Tell me what she did that made her part of this." Sabine pulled the lighter back toward herself. She looked at the document. "You used the pregnancy," she said. "You knew what provisional succession protection meant for your position. You knew that once you carried a Kincaid heir, the board would never move against you regardless of your performance. You made yourself immovable by getting pregnant, and you called it family." She pressed the lighter flat against the table. "I built the public identity of this company. I rebuilt the brand after the Singapore incident, after the Dallas labor dispute, after the hotel fire in Portland that should have ended us. I did that work. You got the title, the voting power, the family name, the trust seat, and then you used your body to cement it. Don't lecture me about innocence." She believed it. That was the thing Arden had to sit with in that moment. Sabine was not performing outrage. She had spent years building a framework in which she was the wronged party, in which her grievance was legitimate, in which Arden's existence in this family was a theft rather than a life. Arden had learned something from Merrick's grandfather, from years of working alongside people who built things. She had learned that the most dangerous person in any room was not the one who wanted power for its own sake. It was the one who had convinced themselves they deserved it more than whoever had it. "The company would have weakened under you," Sabine said. Her voice was flat now, certain in the way of someone laying out a position they have rehearsed many times. You're sentimental. You prioritize preservation over growth. The Harlow deal, the North Star architecture, all of it was built around protecting the existing structure instead of expanding it. A CEO who protects instead of builds is a CEO who stalls. And you wouldn't have stalled. No, I wouldn't have. Arden nodded slowly. Tell me how you built it, she said. The false evidence. Walk me through it. Sabine looked at her. Why? Because you're proud of it, Arden said. And because you're about to burn a document in a stone room with one exit, and I'd like you to keep talking until you've said everything worth hearing. Sabine picked up the lighter again, then she set it down again. Her pride was doing exactly what Arden had predicted it would do. She had spent months constructing something intricate and nearly airtight, and the only person in the world who fully understood how much work it had taken was standing across the table from her. Merrick brought me the first recordings without knowing what I was building, she said. He recorded conversations you had in his presence. I told him I needed documentation of your instability for the board transition file. That part he believed. She tapped one finger against the table. The medical appointment audio came from a device I placed in the waiting area of your prenatal clinic during a routine building visit we scheduled as a charitable donation walkthrough. Your home recordings were from a device Merrick carried without knowing it was active. She paused. The signature samples he provided willingly. He thought they were for internal company documents. A beat. The voice assembly took 11 weeks. Your speech patterns are unusual. Specific cadences. It took a long time to find enough source material for the authorization oath. 13 seconds were missing, Arden said. The word willingly, Sabine said. I could never find you using it in the right register. The oath requires an affirmation of willing consent. I couldn't assemble the word cleanly from what I had. I considered re-recording the whole sequence, but by then the gala was close and the gap was short enough that I believed the system would pass it. She believed North Star was a verification layer, not a reconstruction engine. That was her actual mistake. She had done her research on the system's public-facing function and stopped there. And after the vote, Arden said, once the resolution passed and you held the key, Merrick would have retained the title, Sabine said. Chairman publicly, but operational control of the trust, the archive access, the succession registry, all of it would have transferred to whoever held the founder's key seal. The charter language is old. It was written before anyone anticipated that the key holder and the chairman might be different people. She finally let herself look slightly satisfied. It was an elegant structure. It was, Arden said. And then you would have removed Merrick as well, Arden said. Once you had the key and the operational authority, he would have removed himself, Sabine said. I didn't need to push. Merrick without power becomes difficult very quickly. He would have found reasons to exit. I would have accommodated him generously. She said that last word with a calm certainty that was almost clinical. She had mapped this out. Every stage. Every exit. The door to the archive opened behind Arden. Callum came through first. Then Gerald Farr. Then a woman named Diane Cho, one of the two independent board members Arden had spoken with the week before. Both of them had agreed, without hesitation, to be present in the adjoining records room during the confrontation. Both of them had heard everything. Sabine looked at the three people standing in the archive doorway. She looked at Callum, who was holding a recording device that had been active since Arden first walked through the door. She looked at Arden. That's every essential element of your case, Arden said quietly, confirmed by you in your own words. Sabine stood very still. Then she sat down. Just sat down, right there at the archive table, with the forged resolution in front of her and the lighter she had never used sitting beside it, and she looked at the document for a long time without speaking.
Diane Cho said, Ms. Roth, I'd advise you not to touch that document or anything on this table.
Sabine didn't touch anything. She just sat. The weeks that followed were not clean. Nothing about winning is ever as clean as the moment it happens. The Harlow licensing agreement was voided within 48 hours of the board hearing. Harlow's legal team cited the architecture disclosure and moved quickly. $340 million gone. The Phoenix expansion was suspended. The Seattle and Dallas partnerships were put under review. The company's value dropped in a single week by more than anyone was willing to say out loud in official communications. 412 employees received notices that their projects were on hold pending restructuring. Most of them would be affected for months. Some would not have positions to return to. The board, in a decision Arden had expected and did not fight, removed both her and Merrick from their active roles during the investigation. Temporary, pending review. Patricia Voss delivered the decision in a short meeting with no ceremony. She looked at Arden and said, "This is procedural, not personal." Arden said she understood. Sabine's attorneys, 3 days after the archive confrontation, produced a set of documents. Merrick's real signature. On correspondence that gave Sabine explicit access to Arden's private medical calendar, On a directive approving the North Star Research Initiative Sabine had used to study the system's limitations, and on an early draft of the succession resolution that predated the gala by 4 months. Sabine's position was clear. Even if she had built the conspiracy, Merrick had handed her the materials. She had not acted alone. She was prepared to demonstrate that in detail. Merrick's attorneys called Arden's attorneys and asked for a meeting. She didn't attend it herself. She let Callum go. He came back 2 hours later and sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "He wants to know if there's a version of this where he cooperates fully and retains some position in the company." Arden asked what Callum thought. Callum said, "I think his only credible path is full disclosure. I think he knows it." The second board meeting was scheduled 3 weeks later. Merrick stood at the table. He didn't have prepared remarks in front of him. He had told his attorney he wasn't using them. He acknowledged the affair, directly with dates without framing it as a lapse in judgment or a consequence of stress. He acknowledged removing the founder's key seal from Arden's private safe. He acknowledged signing documents he had chosen not to read, and he chose the word chosen, specifically because his attorney had suggested the word without, and Merrick had crossed it out. He released every private message between himself and Sabine to the board and to Callum's office, and then he resigned as chief executive, verbally, in the room, and then in a signed letter he had prepared the night before. He surrendered his temporary voting authority without conditions. He sat down. No one said anything for a moment. Gerald Farr asked one question. He asked whether Merrick had known at any point that the succession resolution was designed to strip Arden's unborn child of inheritance protection. Merrick said, "I didn't read the document closely enough to know." That is my answer, and I understand it's not a good one. Sabine was dismissed from Kincaid House Hotels in a formal action that took 11 minutes. Civil proceedings were opened on 4 counts: falsifying evidence, theft of intellectual property, unauthorized use of protected medical information, and attempting to manipulate a legally binding family trust. Her attorneys were already preparing a counterposition that would take years to fully resolve. Arden was not restored immediately. She had known she wouldn't be. She spent 2 weeks preparing a restructuring plan. She started from the employees, 412 people whose projects were suspended. She built the plan around them, backward, working from what they needed toward what the company could sustain. She presented it to Patricia Voss, first privately before the full board. Patricia read the entire thing without interrupting. When she finished, she said, "The board's primary concern is going to be concentration of authority. You're proposing a structure where you control the authentication network and the hotel trust simultaneously. I'm proposing a structure where neither this family nor any future individual controls North Star outright," Arden said. "That's different." The full board rejected the first proposal by a vote of 7 to 5. She took it back. She added independent oversight provisions. She added employee protection covenants. She restructured the licensing framework so that any future North Star agreement required approval from a 3-person committee, none of whom could be a Kincaid family member. She brought back 2 of the board members who had voted against it and walked through the new language line by line. The second vote passed, 8 to 4, 1 vote more than she needed. She sat in her car afterward for a few minutes before driving home, not celebrating, just sitting. The baby was moving, the steady familiar rhythm she had come to know over 7 months, and Arden put her hand flat on her stomach and breathed. She had a company to rebuild. She had hundreds of jobs to protect with a plan that had passed by a single vote. She had a legal process ahead of her that would take years. She had a child coming in 6 weeks who would grow up in the wreckage of things that broke before she arrived. None of it was clean, but it was hers. Merrick came to the brownstone on a gray afternoon in late November. She heard the car, heard the steps, answered the door before he knocked. He was carrying a plain wooden box, no family crest on it, no engraving. The kind of box you buy when you want to give something without making it a presentation. She let him in. They stood in the front room. She didn't offer him a seat and he didn't ask for one. He held the box out toward her. She opened it. The founder's key seal was inside, the original. The crescent scratched near the base, exactly as she remembered it. Sitting on plain cloth, nothing ceremonial, just resting there. "I don't have the right to keep this," he said. She looked at the key for a moment. Then she looked at him. "You didn't lose your family because you held the wrong key," she said. "You lost us because every time you had a choice, you opened the door for someone else." He absorbed that without flinching. She gave him credit for that. "I know," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folder. He put it on the side table beside them and stepped back. She opened it. A property sale agreement for his private penthouse in Midtown. The proceeds directed to an employee recovery fund under independent management. A therapy intake summary, 3 months of sessions already completed with 2 more scheduled per week going forward. And a legal document, clean and formal, separating his parental rights claim from any future position or financial interest in her company. He had done all of it before coming to her door. He hadn't come to propose it and wait for her approval. He had just done it. Those actions may help you become a better father, she said. She closed the folder. They don't automatically make you my husband again. I know that too, he said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wooden box in her hands, the key resting inside it. I want to earn a place in the baby's life, he said. I'm not asking for anything else. No titles, no positions, no second chances with us. I'm asking for the chance to show up consistently and let that mean something over time. She looked at him for a long time. That will be her choice to make, Arden said. Eventually. Not mine, I understand. He left a few minutes later. She stood at the front window and watched the car pull away down the street, and then she took the wooden box to her office and set it on the shelf. 1 year later, she stood on a stage in front of 400 people. The venue was not a Kincaid hotel. She had chosen a civic auditorium downtown, neutral ground. The stage was clean and the lighting was direct, and there were no family crests anywhere in the room. Behind her, built into a floor-to-ceiling glass case that had been installed specifically for this evening, was the found's key seal, the original. The crescent scratch visible if you knew to look, lit by a single downward beam, not elevated, not dramatized, just present. Below it, a small bronze plaque. She had written the words herself. Authority does not belong to the person who holds the key. It belongs to the person willing to open the truth. She stepped to the microphone and introduced the independent North Star Trust Network. Not Kincaid property, not family-held, not licensing dependent on any single corporation. A network built around the original authentication system, governed by independent oversight, owned by a nonprofit structure designed to protect the records of families and institutions that couldn't afford to have their histories rewritten. She spoke for 18 minutes. She did not use notes. When she finished, the room came up. She stood there for a moment in the sound of it. 7 months ago, she had sat in a car after a board vote that barely passed and held her hand on her stomach and tried to breathe. 6 months ago, she had delivered a daughter at a hospital in Brooklyn, small and loud and entirely her own, and she had lain in that room afterward looking at the ceiling and feeling, for the first time in 2 years, like the ground beneath her was actually solid. She had named her Harlan, after Merrick's grandfather, the man who built the key, who understood what it was for, who knew enough to place it in the right hands and say what it was capable of doing. Merrick was in the audience.
Fourth row, left side.
He was not on the stage. He was not introduced. He was not beside her. He had bought a ticket like everyone else and taken a seat like everyone else. She could see him from where she stood. He was clapping. He was looking at the stage with an expression she recognized. Not pride exactly, and not grief exactly, but some combination of both that belonged to people who watched someone they failed become something they couldn't have made them. He was beginning to understand, she thought. That regret could not give back what he had thrown away. That it could not restore a position or a marriage or the version of a future that had existed before he started making the choices he made. What it could do, if he let it, was teach him how to show up, consistently, without expectation. The way you earn the right to stand beside something you once abandoned, not by demanding readmission but by becoming, slowly and without an audience, someone who deserves to be invited back. Whether that happened was not her problem to solve. She had her daughter and her company and her name on a system that would outlast all of them. She had a stage and a room full of people and a key behind glass that no one was carrying anymore because no one needed to. The plaque said what it needed to say. She stepped back from the microphone and the lights came up and she walked off the stage into the rest of her life.